Good morning, Mr. Daldis here with your Chapter 15, Section 4 reading on the Atlantic slave trade. Your focus question for this section will be, how did the Atlantic slave trade shape the lives and economies of Africans and Europeans? Section 4, the Atlantic slave trade. Enslaved Africans like Oluda Aquino formed part of an international trade network that arose during the 1500s. The Spanish were the first major European partners in the slave trade, buying slaves to labor in Spain's South American empire. As other European powers established colonies in the Americas, the slave trade, and with its entire international trade network, intensified. Triangular trade across the Atlantic. The Atlantic slave trade formed one of the three legs international trade network known as triangle trade. This was a triangle-shaped series of Atlantic trade routes linking Europe, Africa, and the Americas. Shipping people as goods. Triangular trade worked in the following way. On the first leg, merchant ships brought European goods, including guns, cloth, and cash, to Africa. In Africa, the merchants traded these goods for slaves. On the second leg, known as the Middle Passage, the slaves were transported to the Americas. There, the enslaved Africans were exchanged for sugar, molasses, and other products manufactured at plantations owned by Europeans. On the final leg, merchants carried sugar, molasses, cotton, and other American goods such as furs, salt fish, and rum made from molasses. These goods were shipped to Europe, where they were traded at a profit for the European commodities that merchants needed to return to Africa. Industries and cities thrive. Triangular trade was immensely profitable for many people. Merchants grew wealthy. Even though there were risks, such as losing ships at sea, the money to be made from valuable cargo usually outweighed the risks. Certain industries that supported trade thrived. For example, a shipbuilding industry in New England grew to support the shipping industry. Other colonial industries, such as fishing, raising tobacco, and processing sugar, became hugely successful. Thriving trade led to successful port cities. European cities such as Nantes, France, and Bristol, England, grew prosperous because of triangular trade. In North America, even newly settled towns such as Salem, Massachusetts, and Newport, Rhode Island, quickly grew into thriving cities. Even though few slaves were imported directly to the northern cities, the success of the port cities was made possible by the Atlantic slave trade. Checkpoint. How did triangular trade affect colonial economies? Horrors of the Middle Passage. To merchants, the Middle Passage was just one leg of triangular trade. For enslaved Africans, the Middle Passage was a horror. The trek to the ships. The terrible journey began before the slave ships set sail. Most Africans were taken from inland villages. After they were enslaved, they were forced to march to coastal ports. Men, women, and children were bound with ropes and chains, often to one another, and forced to walk distances as long as 1,000 miles. They might be forced to carry heavy loads, and often the men's necks were encircled with thick iron bands. Many captives died along the way. Others tried to escape and were often quickly recaptured and brutally punished. Those who survived the march were restrained in coastal holding pens and warehouses in slave shipping ports such as Elmina, Ghana, or Gorée, Senegal. They were held there until European traders arrived by ship. Aboard the floating coffins. Once purchased, Africans were packed below the decks of slave ships, usually in chains. Hundreds of men, women, and children were crammed into a single vessel for voyages that lasted from 3 weeks to 3 months. The ships faced many perils, including storms at sea, raids by pirate ships, and mutinies, or revolts by the captives. Disease was the biggest threat to the lives of the captives and the profit of the merchants. Of the slaves who died, most died of dysentery. Many died of smallpox. Many others died from apparently no disease at all. Whatever the cause, slave ships became floating coffins on which up to half the Africans on board died from disease or brutal mistreatment. Some enslaved Africans resisted, and others tried to seize control of the ship and return to Africa. Suicide, however, was more common than mutiny. Many Africans believed that in death they would be returned to their home countries, so they hanged themselves, starved themselves, or leapt overboard. Checkpoint. How did enslaved Africans resist captivity? Impact of the slave trade. The slave trade brought enormous wealth to merchants and traders, and provided the labor that helped profitable colonial economies grow. Yet the impact on Africans was devastating. African states and societies were torn apart. The lives of individual Africans were either cut short or forever brutalized. Historians still debate the number of Africans who were directly involved in the Atlantic slave trade. In the 1500s, they estimate about 2,000 enslaved Africans were sent to the Americas each year. In the 1780s, when the slave trade was at its peak, that number approached 80,000 a year. By the mid-1800s, when the overseas slave trade was finally stopped, an estimated 11 million enslaved Africans had reached the Americas. Another 2 million probably died under the brutal conditions of the Middle Passage between Africa and the Americas. Checkpoint. How did the slave trade affect Africans? That's the end of section 4. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.